Was I the only one that noticed sympathy for Guns N' Roses version of Knocking on Heaven's Door playing leading into this session? I'm not sure if there's a message that's built into that or what, but I did the Freudian slip there with the sympathy for the devil because it reminded me of a true story. In 1991, I had a pretty bad motorcycle accident, and when the rescue squad came to get me, I was kind of in and out of consciousness in shock. And when they put me in the rescue squad and drove me to the hospital, the only thing I can remember about the accident or anything around it was that Sympathy for the Devil was playing on the radio in the rescue squad. And I thought that maybe that was going to be the last thing I ever heard, and I wasn't sure if that was the direction I was going or not. But so anyways, I've got a lot of material that I'm going to cover, and even worse than standing between you and lunch, I'm standing between you and a chance to drive some fantastic hybrids. So let me just jump right into it. And what I essentially want to cover today is I want to talk a little bit about the role of hybrids in meeting U.S. fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulations. And then perhaps more importantly, or interestingly anyways, is I want to delve a little bit into what we can learn from the hybrid experience when it comes to future advanced technologies and so-called zero-emission vehicle technology. So that's mainly what I want to cover. All markets are unique, and all regulatory environments are unique. I think the U.S. is unique in its uniqueness with regards to other countries. We have many different regulations and programs in place that are all kind of competing to do the same thing. We've had fuel economy, so-called CAFE regulations administered by the Department of Transportation under one law since the mid-'70s, late '70s. We also have, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, we have the Environmental Protection Agency regulating greenhouse gases for motor vehicles under a different law, the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act also allows the state of California, whose pollution control program pre-existed the existence of EPA, to adopt their own standards if EPA allows them to do so, if they're as protective as EPA standards. And then yet another part of the Clean Air Act allows other states to then adopt the California standards. So, and then finally, California also has adopted zero-emission vehicle regulations, which are as well adopted by other states. The top three of these were the subject of the so-called One National Program agreements that were reached with the administration, with the states, the environmental NGOs, and others back originally in 2009. The first set of these so-called ONP, or One National Program standards, were finalized in 2010. And then there was a second round that added on to that was finalized in August of 2012 that sets in place a combined federal program, a sort of a harmonized EPA NHTSA program. And the states agreed not to enforce their state-by-state regulations as long as the manufacturers were complying with the combined federal program. That was a huge thing for us just in terms of simplifying the regulatory landscape. The challenge before was you had two different federal agencies, two different laws, two different programs, and all the states enforcing individually their own regulations. And we sell different things in different states. We sell trucks in Vermont, we sell, more cars in California, et cetera. So we're really facing about 16 different regulations, all trying to do the same thing. So this really simplified the landscape for us, but it also set fairly aggressive standards. Canada and Mexico are also moving forward in the adoption of these. Canada's a little further along. We have folks here from TCI that you can speak to as well about their perspective on some of these issues. And Mexico has just recently put in place their first ever greenhouse gas standards as well, and I think they are looking to potentially add on to that for future model years. Our core strategy, not surprising given the topic of this event, for meeting these standards is hybrid technology. We're going to be doing what a lot of the industry is also going to be doing in terms of downsizing, looking at turbocharging, direct injection, lightweight materials, all the advanced internal combustion engine technologies. But for us, hybrid is really a core compliance strategy. And really, to be quite honest, the reason is that consumers like hybrids. And it's really hard. It's really, really hard when you sell 2 million vehicles a year or more to change your fuel economy average by selling 5,000, 10,000 super efficient vehicles. You have to sell mass market quantities of efficient vehicles to really move the dial on fuel economy. So that's another reason, aside from just the product attributes and the consumer acceptance of the technology. You've seen some other numbers today, about 4%. This is the cumulative hybrid sales so far in the US. We're at about 3.5% to 4% in 13 years. I would just point you to the slight crook in the curve right around January of 2005, which I'll come back to later when you can see that hybrid sales really took off. Let me move briefly to, well, not briefly, probably for the rest of the discussion, to zero-emission vehicle regulations and requirements. As I said at the outset, California has adopted zero-emission vehicle requirements. This chart shows the Air Resources Board's estimate of what the new vehicle penetration would look like in each year under the regulations. The ZEV technologies include pure electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. The green area is the projection for the plug-in hybrid sales, and this is California only. The volumes are, in some sense, less important in this discussion than the percentage. In the next 13 years, California is expecting 15% of the new vehicle fleet to be plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles, and fuel cells. As I also mentioned at the outset, other states have adopted these regulations. The challenge is that the states can only adopt these standards in identicality, which is not a real word, but more a term that has come from various lawsuits and other things, in identicality to California. So the same percentages basically apply individually in each of the states. The total volume is about 2.5 times the California volume alone. Now, Toyota has, we think, an exciting portfolio of products that we're putting out there to help comply with these regulations. We have our RAV4 EV, which was mentioned earlier, for sale in California. The plug-in Prius, which was also discussed a bit earlier, which is on sale in 14 states, I believe. The IQ EV, which is a low-volume kind of station car, shared car project that we're doing. And then, as was mentioned earlier as well, in 2015, hydrogen fuel cell vehicle coming to market. If we look at the sales so far of these so-called ZEV technologies, we can see that in mass, they kind of pale in comparison to where we've been so far with hybrids. But not to be, that's not unexpected. The question we hear a lot is, well, if you take that little sliver at the end and you reorient it back to the beginning of hybrids, aren't these vehicles selling just as well as the early hybrids were? And doesn't that then speak well for the future of those technologies? So I did that, and in fact, the numbers speak for themselves. The electric vehicles are about on pace with the early hybrids, and the plug-in hybrid electrics are doing a little bit better. But in some sense, I actually think this is kind of an apples to coconuts comparison. And the reason is that the conditions, the market, and the policies are very different for these new technologies than we had for our hybrids in the early years. There are about 12 models of these technologies, the advanced ones, on the market today. During the first 31 months of hybrid introduction, there was the Insight and the Prius, and that was it. Very different situation in terms of gasoline prices, and very different conditions in terms of policies to promote the vehicles. Let me just use a snarky little picture, I guess, to sort of show the difference. The current situation with the more advanced technologies is there's a huge tailwind, in some sense, pushing these technologies. First of all, you had a hybrid market that was already established, so a familiarity with electric drive technology among consumers. Generous federal tax credits, state tax credits, particularly in California, HOV lane access for single occupant drivers, billions of dollars in battery loans and grants and manufacturing, and infrastructure development. You heard from Jerry earlier, Jerry was at Whole Foods trying to get people to buy Priuses. So there's a very different set of circumstances that are in place now. We were trying to form a market for hybrids against, quite frankly, some criticism and ridicule for trying to do it. there was a federal tax incentive, a tax deduction, but it was only worth about $600 if you even qualified for it. And there was no HOV lane access in California. So then what I did is, and yet we've achieved similar levels. So what I did was I went back to that hook in the curve that I mentioned earlier in the hybrid sales, which was around January of 2005 when HOV access was available and when the federal tax credit was put in place. And coincidentally, there were about 12 models of hybrids on the road during that period of time. And if you look at the situation in that context, this is not a perfect comparison, I understand that, but it provides some perspective in terms of how much policy can play a role in promoting the market. There's actually 10 times more hybrids sold in the 31 months after these policy mechanisms were put in place than there are of the plug-in vehicles now. So the key question is, what is going to be that item which causes the knee in the curve on the plug-in type of vehicles? And what most people are hanging their hats on is battery cost reductions. So the Electrification Coalition, who I figure is probably one of the more optimistic groups in terms of battery cost reduction, published a study about 3 weeks ago where they're projecting $275 a kilowatt hour battery cost reduction in the next 7 to 10 years. So I kind of scratched my head and said, well, in 7 to 10 years, we probably won't have all these tax credits still available. The federal tax credit phases out once certain volumes are reached. And if you just do the math for 3 vehicles that I picked, the Leaf, the Volt, and the Prius, what you lose in tax incentives over time is more than what you would gain in battery cost savings at $275 a kilowatt hour cost reduction. So the apparent price or apparent cost of the vehicle would actually go up in this scenario. We don't know if this is going to happen. We don't think tax credits should live forever in this fiscal environment. We certainly don't think they will live forever. But anyhow, that's a different view on that. Sort of moving to the next point I wanted to discuss is what can we learn about the regionality of hybrid sales and what does that mean for the advanced technologies? What we've seen in California is that they've been a very welcoming market, California and Oregon, particularly to hybrids, with nearly twice the penetration of hybrid sales as the other states that have adopted California's zero-emission vehicle regulations. And what we've seen in the early markets is nearly an identical trend with the plug-in zero-emission type vehicles. The scales are different, I will point that out. Everybody was concerned that we were implying the plug-in sales are the same as the Prius. They're not. This is a 7% scale, that's a 1% scale, and a 0.8% scale. So just keep that in mind. But the trend is the same. What we see in California with uptake is what we're seeing with hybrids, is what we're seeing with the more advanced technologies. So now if we go back to the basic requirements of the ZEV mandate, again, focusing on the percentages, what we see is that in 13 years, with the most successful alternative technology that's ever been put out, we've gotten to 3.5% nationally, 6% in California. That's the 6% number. 2025 is 13 years from now. So in the same time frame in California, we would need to get 2.5 times the penetration of plug-in vehicles and fuel cells that we've gotten with hybrids. And in the Northeast, where we also have to meet the mandate, it's actually 5 to 8 times because those states are at only half the penetration of hybrids. So it's quite a daunting task, especially when you consider that those more advanced vehicles cost more. They require behavioral change from the owners. They have long refueling times. Of course, fuel cells don't. But that doesn't mean we're not trying to get these vehicles out there. We are working to sort of narrow that gap between what's expected of us and kind of where the market is right now. We're working with a lot of different groups on infrastructure development, codes and standards. We are marketing the vehicles. Unfortunately, we're also, incentivizing, and in addition to the government incentives, the OEMs are doing a lot in terms of leases and other things. We're working with our dealers, training them, and obviously we'll continue to look at our product in terms of how to make it more attractive in the future. So just to close out, essentially, hybrids are going to be our core strategy for meeting future regulations, particularly because of the volume that we can get out of them. There's a lot more that can be done. There's a lot of mileage still that we can get out of hybrids, pun intended. For the zero emission technologies, it's a little more questionable. We've got a broad portfolio. We're working to get the vehicles out there. We're particularly bullish on fuel cells, as many of you know, and we'll hear more about. But you know, the future sales of these kind of vehicles still remains a little bit uncertain to us. And as Bob Carter mentioned earlier, you know, the hybrid platform really is a platform for kind of everything we look to do in the future. And if you think about it, the more hybrids you get out there, you know, the more power electronics, the more motors, you get more cost reductions in those things. Those are all directly transferable to other electric drive technologies, whether it be a pure EV, a hydrogen fuel cell hybrid, or a plug-in hybrid. So that concludes my remarks, and thank you all, and I hope you enjoy driving all the cars.